To the second session of the second day. Just before we start in on the second session, a few matters arising, as it were, from the first session. Firstly, for those of you who need to set your body clocks or stomach clocks, we're proposing to take lunch now at around 1 o'clock. Secondly, and getting into the practicalities of this morning's business, there was a generous offer from UNESCO that the network should be taking up a role as a corresponding member of their Committee on Education and Research, or subcommittee, which actually has a much wider role. And I think we're in a position to say straight away that that's something that the network would definitely wish to take up. And we'll look forward to discussing later in this meeting with UNESCO exactly what that corresponding member role will how it will work, but it's certainly something that would be appropriate for the network to take on. And then I'd want to say that there were questions raised both in the presentation and from the floor about the whole question of hidden collections. We're going to move on in this session to be talking about collections at risk, but I just think that we should say it's been really useful today to have this theme of hidden collections identified for us. And I think also as a network, it's a theme that we will want to take up and we will want to discuss with colleagues as to how we can help to address that. And as a first thought, there is an organisation, a sort of charitable annex to the International Council on Archives, which travels under the title of FIDA, which I think with which it might at least be worth opening some discussions about the whole theme of hidden collections and how we can take an international solidarity approach to this particular issue, which has been so graphically and usefully introduced earlier today. So that for the earlier sessions. For this session, I just want to say a few words of introduction and context setting before we have three presentations in this session, one of which is a double presentation. Could you just push the button? No. And the way that I want to set this context is by saying that in the whole area of archives at risk, we have been, as a network, entering into discussions with a number of potential partners. And I think Jens Bull, in his presentation, very clearly identified for us the nature of the potential risks that archives may face, maybe political, maybe climatic and environmental, maybe resource related and so on. But it's clear that throughout the world there are collections in general and literary collections in particular whose very existence in 10 years' time for one of those reasons or several of those reasons is coming into threat. And we as a network aspire to intervene and to see in which ways we can help to address that particular situation. And in some of the areas of potential intervention, there is controversy, which is why it's really useful to think about some of the potential partners with whom we might be working. And on this single slide for this introduction, I've just listed some of the bodies with whom we could potentially cooperate. And obviously, as we've seen earlier, there's a role for UNESCO, ideally a coordinating role in this. Jens also drew attention to the fact that IFLA, the library's international network, is potentially, well, they're working on this already. They've circulated very recently a questionnaire seeking identification of collections at risk, and they would like us to be participating in that. Similarly, ICOM, which is the International Committee for Museums worldwide, is also interested in collections at risk, and if we do manage to bring together a coalition of partners working in this area, then ICOM would be another, as would ICA, the International Council on Archives. Apologies for all the acronyms, by the way. Both ICA as a general organisation and the section for literary archives, my own section within ICA, which is working particularly to draw up a charter on the archives of dissident authors within countries worldwide. And the aspiration there is to set out a whole programme of best practice about the way that dissident authors' papers should both be regarded within particular regimes, collected, the way that archivists should respond, and the particular cases when it might be necessary to transport papers for their own safety and good from one country to another, and the ways in which we ensure that there are proper controls over that sort of potential removal. I'm not going to identify for you the particular work of IMEC, ITEM, and Fondation des Traits, three organizations working in the Mediterranean and Francophone world on the question of archives en péril, archives in peril, because we're going to hear some of that work shortly. PEN International is an important potential partner for us in this work, and an important potential validator, because if we do get into a situation where particular archives are being moved from one area to another for their own protection, we would need the validation of organizations with total international respect, such as PEN International, to validate any action that was being taken in that way. There are a couple of other potential partners at the bottom of this list. The Endangered Archives Programme at the British Library is a digitisation programme which responds to funding requests for collections which are deteriorating or otherwise at risk, where they produce a digital copy so that at least there is a preservation copy of archives which for various reasons, all the reasons that Jens identified, are potentially at risk, and that's something that we can talk about with colleagues outside of meetings, perhaps that opportunity for funding there. And finally, an organisation in Hamburg, which I've put up there, they're particularly interested in the preservation of Asian and African manuscripts in general, but just an example of the sort of other partner with whom we might be working. So I hope that sets a context within which this organisation, this network, can aspire to work with others in order to seek to make some contribution on the undoubtedly grave worldwide issue of archives at risk in general and literary archives at risk in particular. That's by way of introduction. As the chair of this particular session, we have three presentations. Firstly, Cheryl Sylvester from St George's University in Grenada is going to talk to us about specifics of Grenadian archives at risk, and this is a partnership which we very much valued right from the start of this network, and we're waiting to hear from Cheryl about the latest news from Grenada and the way that particular situation has evolved. Secondly, Sophie Hayward from Reading and Albert Dichy from IMEC are going to talk about their perspectives on archives at risk, particularly in the Francophone world, but with some general observations as well. And thirdly, Dominique Taffin from the Archives départementales de la Martinique is going to talk to us about the MEGAN project, Memory of the Islands Gateway for Archival Networking project, and the way that is addressing the issues of bringing together information about disparate archives generally and literary across the Caribbean region. I think although all of those presentations fit in with our notion of archives at risk, archives in danger, they do have their own specificity, and it's probably better if we treat them as three separate presentations. So I'd propose to take a couple of questions after each presentation to get us through the morning, and then if there is time, before lunch, then we could take a more general question session. That's the way I'm proposing to if I can, to chair this particular session. And I'd like to open up by inviting Cheryl Sylvester to talk to us on Grenadian archives under threat. Cheryl.
Thank you very much, David. Now, good morning to everybody again. Trinidad and Tobago is like a second home, and I always welcome a visit. But before I go into my presentation, I would like to first of all record my appreciation to the Diasporic Literary Archive Network for the opportunity to be part of these very wonderful and interesting sessions. Now, as well, though, I really appreciate the opportunity to shed some light on the situation or the plight of archives in Grenada. Now, the loss of one's history and culture often results in an identity crisis, much as is the case of an orphan, or more so an adoptee, who recognizing alienation to a biological past and ancestry, finds him or herself aimless or perhaps rootless. It is an apt analogy to a nation that does not have a national archive, the traditional home of its history and cultural memories. In the case of a nation, that identity crisis is much more profound because it affects the lives and the future of many. In the case of Grenada, though, it affects tens of thousands of people who, after centuries of slavery and colonization, have only recently embarked on their political independence. The forging of national identity is thus of paramount importance. Fortunately, Grenada thus far has not experienced that identity crisis, despite the past 30 years of soul-searching brought about by civil unrest, political independence, a coup d'etat, a revolutionary government, and a U.S. military intervention. But the continued neglect of the establishment of a national archive to house our collective memory can lead to a national identity crisis in the very near future. Now, I know I'm speaking to the converted, but Grenada needs a national archive for all of the obvious reasons: creating a national identity, preservation of its history and culture, making available these records to students and other researchers. But most importantly, Grenada needs a national archive because we are failing to educate our children about Grenada's history and culture. Now, when a Grenadian student attending the T.A. Marichaud Community College, that is an institution that has been named in the memory of T. Albert Marichaud, the father of West Indian Federation, and that person does not know who he was, what he has done, or cannot even identify the West Indian newspaper that he created as his creation, then we have failed. And when Grenadian students at the university level cannot identify the possible effects of slavery on our current society, we have failed. When Grenadian students, or when a Grenadian who completed secondary school visits the National Museum, is totally struck by the story of the slave trade to Grenada, because this is the first time he or she is seeing it or hearing it, we have failed, right? Now, when an enthusiastic primary school student visits the National Museum and demands to see something about the cannibalistic Caribs, we have failed. And when many Grenadians cannot identify or explain the most prominent aspects of their history and culture, it is evident that we have failed as a nation to provide them with the basic building blocks of our national identity, of their identity, and of their confidence in themselves and their place in the world. Of our history, few episodes are remembered with ceremony. And if so, little mention is made of the actual historical occurrence and significance. There are no monuments to Julian Fedor, who one Caribbean historian refers to as Grenada's first national heroes. Neither is there any reverence for the apparent act of self-sacrifice made by the Kalinagos. The steep hill of the steep cliffs of the area referred to as Carib's Leap or Leaper's Hill in the northernmost parish of Grenada stands as a reminder. And to add insult to injury, the addition of a monument with errors illustrates the fact that more than ever before, we need a national archive. Grenadians celebrate very few anniversaries beyond the 20th century. And even Emancipation Day, August 1st, 1836, 1838 as the case may be, which marks the end of the enslavement of our ancestors, it is commemorated as a bank holiday, oftentimes with very few mention of slavery or anything about the freedom of the slave, and if ever any mention is made, it is in very abstract terms. Unlike Barbados with its emancipation monument, Slave in Revolt, Grenada has no monument marking the end of slavery or the slaves themselves. With a tragic history that began with the European settlement over 360 years ago, it is no wonder that Grenadians have chosen not to celebrate or remember aspects of their difficult past. That there is much more emphasis on the 20th and 21st centuries when Grenadians broke free from the restrictive barriers established by slavery and colonialism and struggled towards their nationhood is understandable. It has been argued, though, that the lack of interest or neglect in celebrating more aspects of Grenada's past has to do with the fact that it lacks institutions to preserve, interpret, and celebrate our heritage. The need to create a national identity is rooted in the island's history and culture. Without an institution to house, protect, and interpret Grenada's heritage, the goal of achieving a national identity is diminished. And as a nation, Grenada needs to preserve and make available for the study of its history and culture so that Grenada can learn more about the historical journey made by many throughout the island's history. On February 7, 2014, we celebrated 40 years as an independent nation. However, we shared very little, or maybe I should say no detail at all, about the pre-independence struggles, and we had many with our youths. And I dare say that the 364th anniversary of the massacre of the Amerindians at Leapers Hill will again come and pass without any observance. That we will commemorate Emancipation Day this coming August, but again we will fail to learn more about the slaves, the last slaves in Grenada, or piece together their stories. That we talk proudly about the old architecture like our fortification, yet we neglect to mention that the labor to construct them were caused from the slaves. And again, yesterday, Nicholas, I think, made mention of our built heritage and its connection with tourism. Grenada depends on tourism, basically for its livelihood. But in the year 2014, we are considering tearing down York House, a prime example of a Georgian architecture for which St. George's is well known, without a second thought about its historical and cultural value. Now, I could go on and on, but just to underscore the point that as a nation, we have failed to safeguard the past to benefit future generations. And I dare say that this failure can be attributed in large measure to the absence of national institutions. Now, we recognize that the establishment and maintenance of national institutions like libraries, museums, archives, and so are major undertakings, not just because of their ultimate value to the nation, but because without them, we are like a nation without values. We are mindful that projects of this nature are in need of continuous support to render them viable and useful. No doubt, the decision to establish and maintain these institutions would be costly, endeavors. But the decision not to invest in them will prove costlier in the long run, and actually we are seeing it. So whether we are in Grenada or in the diaspora, we cannot feign ignorance and allow the stories of our people, the stories of our past, our national identity to dissipate. Because as each piece of the puzzle disappears, so too does a part of who we are as biological and social beings, as a people. Without a national identity, we are lost as a nation. And as parents, guardians, aunts, uncles, brothers, and sisters, we owe it to our children and grandchildren and to generations to come, and to generations yet to come who may one day wish to know where they've come from, only to be told that the stories are all lost or scattered far and wide. The continued inattention to national institutions that should house our collective memories will result in the loss of many elements of our heritage. As the global village becomes a reality, we are witnessing on a large scale the disappearance or alienation of our national heritage as the older generation passes on and the memory of them fades away. Without the written records, artifacts, historical sites, oral histories of who we are, where and how we've journeyed, we are at the mercy of outside cultural, technological, and political influences that can have a detrimental effect on our culture. Efforts towards our national archives have been sporadic, to say the least. Apart from the efforts by the deceased Sheila Buckmeyer, and I guess people would have read about her in that attachment you had, who took the initiative to build up the historical section of the public library during her tenure as chief librarian. No government until the People's Revolutionary Government, 1979 to 1983, has done anything to address the status of archives in the country. The Declaration of 1980 as the Year of Education and Production brought with it materials for the library as well as copies of government publications intended for preservation. 26 years later, in 2006, the government of Grenada approved a National Archives Committee to look after the business of archives in Grenada. However, with very vague terms of reference. The committee had very little teeth to effect any real change in the situation. However, it tried. Efforts were made to sensitize the authorities as to the importance of archives and the need for proper legislation that would serve to harness all archival material under a single entity. As a start, the committee focused attention on the following collections: the records at the Supreme Court Registry. Now, these were previously microfilmed through a Mormon project, I think that was going around the Eastern Caribbean in particular a few years ago. However, there is an ongoing project now to digitize all of the registry's records. Then we have the records that was salvaged from the government house after the passage of Hurricane Ivan in 2004. This is a significant portion of that collection was digitized under the Endangered Archive Program in 2010. The remainder is in a very poor state. It still resides in the basement of the Governor General's office. In recent time, though, we learned that there are plans afoot to obtain more suitable accommodation for those records, and in the long run, other archival collections would be added to it. So we're really looking forward to that. But we're not holding our breath. We have had many promises before. And then we have the records of the People's Revolutionary Government. These records are located on the fort in one of our fortifications. That's now the headquarters of the Grenada Police Force. Within recent times, we have learned, though, well, actually, we thought that the records were safe, quote unquote, safe there. Within recent times, we have learned that they're in a physical state of deterioration and it's drastic. And due to termite infestation and moisture, and now demands immediate attention. Unfortunately, there is nothing in place, personnel or otherwise, to address the situation. And everybody would have read about the closure of the public library. And in many islands of the Caribbean, the public library also serves as the stepmother of the archive. And you know, oftentimes in a stepmother, stepchild or children situation, what happens? Be that as it may, it was not, well, probably that was one of the more sort of fortunate situations. However, the public library has been closed since July 2011. The reason for the closure was because the building is in a terrible state of disrepair. Now, apart from the records held at the Supreme Court Registry, this was considered our premier archival collection. But promises by the authorities to relocate both library and archival collection remains just that, promises. Nothing has been done. This closure has exacerbated an already bad situation. Only last week, in discussion with the director of libraries, she pointed out that on a recent visit to the library, she noticed what appears to be white stuff on the floor. When she investigated, she discovered that there were termites, and they have eaten away an entire shelf of books. This is the situation. Now, that archival committee I mentioned earlier had planned to look at other collections. Some of them not too bad, some of them are in one in fairly good state. One of these collections is the Lord Peace collection. Now, originally from Grenada, Lord David Peat migrated to the United Kingdom to pursue studies in medicine. He later became known as the Lord Peat of Hampstead, the first person from the African diaspora to serve in the House of Lords at Westminster. His collection was endowed to St. George's University, and this constitutes a significant part of the archives of St. George's University. This is in good condition. Now, we have the Alistair Hughes' collection. I don't know if some of the people from the region may remember the name Alistair Hughes. Alistair Hughes was a prominent regional journalist whose work covered politics and other issues during the second half of the 20th century until his death in 2005. Now, his collection was endowed to the University of the West Indies because he felt that Grenada did not have the resources to give this collection the care and attention it required. That collection is now sitting in boxes on the premises of the Open Campus in Grenada. And another very interesting collection was the Douglaston Estate records. This estate and its papers reflected a significant aspect of Grenada's history, from colonization to Feathers Rebellion, from slavery to indentureship. It was said that in its heyday, more than 1,000 persons in the community relied directly on or indirectly on these estates for their livelihood. Sadly, we have lost this collection through neglect. And there are many more. I could go on and on. However, I said there are many historical and cultural records available in Grenada. However, many are the records that can also be found outside of Grenada. So it has become, or it is necessary, to consolidate all of these disparate collections of records and make them accessible to the people of Grenada and to the world at large. But we are faced with many challenges. Now, one recognizes that in a small, poor, third world country like Grenada, with very limited resources, there would be challenges. Some of these are, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of establishing and maintaining institutions like libraries and archives and so on. Then we have the present global situation, which I always say is oftentimes blamed for all the things that we should do and we didn't do. And sometimes I wonder if this is just not an excuse for inertia. As mentioned earlier, we have the closure of the public library since July 2011. And at this point, one may wonder whether, first of all, I should say, we do not know when it's going to be reopened. Well, probably I may also add if it's going to be reopened. In hindsight, I think probably it would have been easier to keep this rundown, dilapidated building open, and people would have access to the collection instead of the situation as it prevails now. Then we have the public's apathy towards the closure. We murmur among ourselves, but there is no public outcry against the closure. And, not too long ago, there was an article in one of our weekly newspapers, about the state of the building that houses the archive, the public library and archive. Nothing was said about the contents and the unavailability of the contents of both library and archives to the Grenadian people. Then there is, I guess, if you're interested in establishing archives and libraries, you would have trained personnel. There is an absence of trained personnel, and I don't want to go into the details about the train because the persons who are trained were not trained basically on the initiative of government, but it was individuals taking the initiative to go and be trained, right? So no one in the public sector has been trained to manage, work in, or whatever in an archive. This, I think, speaks volume about our interest in archives. And there, of course, without all of this, there is the absence of any environmentally controlled facility to safeguard what is still available. There is also the absence of archival legislation. Now, like everyone else, we have our challenges, but these challenges are not insurmountable. One also recognizes that if we want something, we would make the necessary sacrifices for the things that we value. Present situation. Recently, we were informed that the Governor General received a small grant for the rental of a building to house the collection now residing in the basement of our office. We were also told that with time, other archival collection would also be housed there. As I mentioned earlier, there is a place in Grenada named Hope, so we live in hope. Now, we hope that the next step would give attention to archival legislation and the reinstitution of the National Archival Committee with some teeth, with some very definite terms of reference. Excuse me. Grenada has lost a great deal of its irreplaceable records through fires, neglect, deterioration, and natural disasters. Others are stored in repositories abroad, overseas. Though potentially costly, they can be repatriated as originals or copies. The time has come, though, to remove the threat to our historical and cultural heritage and to establish a Grenada National Archive. Excuse me. The establishment of a Grenada National Archive will be an affirmation of the people and government of Grenada that they have taken upon themselves the preservation of their history and heritage, and thus create for them and preserve their national identity. It is hoped that the availability and the analysis of original historical records will stimulate national dialogue, which can only help to rid the past of the shame as we recognize that we are a people constant. Excuse me. Yeah. It is hoped that the availability and analysis of original historical records will stimulate national dialogue, which can only help to rid the past of its shame as we recognize that we are a people constantly changing. It will also help to correct some of the historical myths that have developed as a result of the lack or absence of historical records, and we will surely add a sense of pride as we join the ranks of the nations. I have some, thank you. As we join the ranks of the nations that have made a deliberate attempt to preserve the memories of their people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for that stark presentation, which... Do you want to stay there for questions?
Okay.
I mean, sit if you wish. Which gives us both the geopolitical context, the educational, cultural context, the island-specific context, even the reference to monuments, which was very evocative, and above all, the historical context, the reference to the setting of the history of the island, especially in the appalling history of slavery, and the impact of the absence of national institutions and the importance of national identity. So a very clear presentation of the scope of the problem. Are there questions and comments from members of the audience, please? Questions to Cheryl or observations on the presentation that she's given us?
Well, I would like to thank you for this very strong and convincing presentation about the need for national archives in Grenada. I would just suggest that in your work for this, I'm sure you'll get a lot of support from the region, which is essential here. I would also just remind that the government of Jamaica has voted for the Universal Declaration on Archives when it was adopted by UNESCO, so maybe it's worth recalling this in the discussions that you have going on in Jamaica, and of course there's a UNESCO office in Jamaica as well, in Kingston. And then I would just say, but that it's really beyond the literary archives, of course, but I would just say that a strong argument that may work, well, sometimes we can hope, as you say, is to go beyond the cultural heritage and the national identity issue and move to the more current records. I mean, simply saying that records management is essential, and that's also why you need a national archives. I mean, that is good practices for retention schedules and the whole management of the current records from the public sector. If the government is to be held accountable for its actions, if you want a good governance system in general, then you need an institution. Indeed, as you say, first of all, you need the archival legislation, you need the whole infrastructure. It costs something, but what you get out of it is so much more. So, well, I can just encourage you. It's a heroic fight, and you need to gain that. I hope you will. Thanks.
Okay, let me say first of all that I'm attached to the St. George's University. So I'm not in the government system, and we discussed with the persons employed with government. In fact, we all collaborated on the presentation and the composition of this presentation. Now, we have on many occasions made representation about the need for a records management program, because I mean what I've said doesn't touch, it's not a tip of the iceberg. Let me give you an example. We have now, the government had a plan to bring all of its ministries under, a single building in a single location. In one of the buildings that housed the Ministry of Education, when the government moved, that building is now was now given to the National Museum. when the Ministry of Education moved from that building, they left behind them, well, what the person in charge of the museum then told me, truckloads of records, including personal records, personal files. When the people in the museum went to take over that building, those files were dumped. Personal records were dumped. That's just one example. There is no records management program. Many years ago, Carbica had a meeting in Grenada, and one we discussed, we brought in people who are in the government registries, in the registries of the various departments, and spoke to them about the need for records management program. These people were very enthusiastic. However, they were not in charge, and so nothing has been done. And up till recently, people would meet me and said, "What about that program you mentioned?" But I guess if you have the will and if it's important to you, you will do whatever it takes. This is just, a small part of what we're dealing with. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yes, Deborah Jenkins.
I can't begin to imagine what it's like. Sorry. I can't begin to imagine what it's like to be in the position that you're in. But in the time I have been working with the International Council on Archives, I have had the privilege of traveling around the world and meeting many people, many colleagues in very, very difficult situations. And there are models, there are examples of people getting out of the sort of environment, the sort of difficult situation you're talking about, and from which people in Grenada might get ideas and encouragement. And one of the models that struck me as you were talking is actually Malta. It's thousands of miles away from here, but it is an island. And the way they started was not with an official committee, but actually a group of a circle of friends of the archives of the island. And it was through the engine of that committee that the whole process of building what's now become a very nice, vibrant service. It was through that group of friends who weren't necessarily in government, who weren't necessarily archivists, who weren't necessarily at the university, that process of education, that process of sharing, that process of shaming started. And I think there are connections to be made, there are friendships to be made across the world, and there are examples of that would give you encouragement.
Thank you very much. Incidentally, one of my colleagues at St. George's University asked that same question. He said, hypothetically, if there is a group of friends of the library, of friends of archives that want to raise some funds to assist the situation, is that a possibility? And I said, we'll talk about that when I return, because I really like the idea, and I think we have to make a start. It's not just the government has the more or less say so, but we as individuals, this is our history, this is our culture, and then I think we should probably start, if it's baby steps, to do something, and I agree with that. Yeah.